known it over the years. We will forever turn this grave constitutional power into a tool for adjudicating policy disputes and political disagreements among all of us. The framers, in their wisdom, cautioned us against this dangerous path, and I believe the Senate will heed their warning. The other article, the House manager's obstruction of Congress claim, is similarly flawed. Congress's investigative and oversight powers are critical tools, and we use them in ensuring our system of checks and balances. But those powers are not absolute. The President, too, as head of a co-equal branch of government, enjoys certain privileges and immunities from congressional fact-finding. That is his constitutional right and has been the right of former presidents from both parties. The President's mere assertion of privileges and immunities is not impeachable. It's not an impeachable offense. Endorsing otherwise would be unprecedented and would ignore the past practices of administrations of both parties. Adopting otherwise would drastically undermine the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution. This was not what our framers intended. Mr. President, nowhere in the Constitution, as you know, or in the federal statute is abuse of power or obstruction of Congress listed as a crime. Nowhere. What constitutes an impeachable offense is not left to the discretion of the Congress. We cannot expand, I believe, on the scope of actions that could be deemed impeachable beyond that which the framers intended. What we really have here, I believe, is nothing more than the abuse of the power of impeachment itself by the Democratic House. Doesn't our country deserve better? The President certainly deserves better. And today I'm proud to stand and repudiate those very weak impeachment efforts, and I will accordingly vote to acquit the President on both sides, both articles. Mr. President, my hope is that in the future Congress will reject this episode and instead choose to be guided by the Constitution and the words of our framers. Mr. President, basically I believe it's a time to move on. We know that the American economy is booming. The United States is projecting strength and promoting peace abroad, and the President is unbowed. And I believe the American people see all of this. At the end of the day, Mr. President, the ultimate judgment rests in their hands. In my judgment, that is just as it should be. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, Benjamin Franklin knew the strength of our Constitution, but he also knew its vulnerability. His words, oft repeated on this floor, "A republic, if you can keep it," were a stark warning. Franklin believed every generation could face the challenge of protecting and defending our nation's liberty-affirming document. We know this personally. Before we can legally serve as senators, we must publicly swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. A trial of impeachment, more than any other Senate assignment, tests the oath each one of us takes before the people of this nation. The President's legal team warns us of the danger of impeachment and conviction. They tell us to think carefully about what the removal of a duly elected president could mean for our democracy. But if we should have our eyes wide open to the danger of conviction, we also cannot ignore the danger of acquittal. The facts of this impeachment are well known, and many Republicans concede that they are likely true. They believe, as I do, that President Trump pressured the Ukrainian president by withholding vital military aid and a prized White House visit in return for the announcement of an investigation of the Bidens and the Russian-concocted CrowdStrike fantasy. Some of these same Republicans acknowledge that what the president did was inappropriate. At least one has used the word impeachable, but many say they're still going to vote to acquit him regardless. So let's open our eyes to the morning after a judgment of acquittal. Facing a well-established election siege, by Russia and other enemies of the United States, we, the Senate, will have absolved a president who continues to brazenly invite foreign interference in our elections. Expect more of the same. A majority of this body will have voted for the president's argument that inviting interference by a foreign government is not impeachable if it serves the president's personal political interest. We will also have found for the first time in the history of this nation that an impeachment proceeding in the Senate can be conducted without any direct witnesses or evidence presented on either side of the case, and that a president facing impeachment can ignore subpoenas to produce documents or witnesses to Congress. Alexander Hamilton described the Senate as the very best venue for an impeachment trial because it is independent and dignified, in his words. When the Senate voted 51-49 against witnesses and evidence, those 51 raised into question any claim to independence or dignity. In addition, an acquittal will leave the extreme views stated by the President's defense counsel, Alan Dershowitz, unchallenged. First, that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense. Second, that the impeachment charges against the President were constitutionally insufficient. And third, his most dangerous theory, that unless the President has committed an actual crime, his conduct cannot be corrupt or impeachable as long as he believes it was necessary for his reelection. By this logic, Professor Dershowitz would have excused Richard Nixon's ordering of IRS audits of his political enemies. Mr. Dershowitz has created an escape clause to impeachment which is breathtaking in its impact and unfounded in our legal history. We've all received a letter signed by nearly 300 constitutional law scholars flatly rejecting the arguments offered by the President's defense team. I ask unanimous consent the scholar's letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Yet a verdict of acquittal by the Senate blesses the professor's tortuous reasoning. An acquittal verdict would also give President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, a pat on the back to continue his global escapades, harassing American ambassadors whose service he distrusts and lounging at European cigar bars with an entourage of post-Soviet amigos. More than anything, a verdict of acquittal says a majority of the Senate believes this president is above the law and cannot be held accountable for conduct abusing the powers of his office. And make no mistake, this president believes that's true. On July the 23rd, 2 days before his phone call with President Zelensky, President Trump spoke to a group of young supporters and he said, and I quote, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." This is the dangerous principle that President Trump and his lawyers are asking us with a verdict of acquittal to accept. Under the oath I have sworn, I cannot. What does it say of this Congress and our nation that in 3 years we have become so anesthetized to outrage that for a majority in this Senate, there is nothing this president can do or say that rises to the level of blushworthy, let alone impeachable? Nearly 6 years ago, I traveled to Ukraine with a bipartisan group of Senate colleagues led by John McCain. It was one of the John's whirlwind visits where we crammed 5 days' worth of meetings into 48 hours. We arrived in Kyiv on March 14, 2014. It was bitterly cold. Ukrainians had just ousted a corrupt Russian-backed leader who looted the national treasury and hollowed out their nation's military. They'd done so by taking to the streets, risking their lives for democracy and a better future. More than 100 ordinary citizens in Kyiv had been killed by security forces of the old government simply because they were protesting for democracy. Seeing Ukraine in a fragile democratic transition, Vladimir Putin pounced on them, ordered an invasion, and occupied Crimea. Putin and his thinly disguised Russian thugs were on the verge of seizing Donetsk in the east. I asked the Prime Minister what Ukraine needed to defend itself. He said, "Everything. We don't have anything that floats, flies, or runs." Many may not appreciate how devastating Russia's war on Ukraine has been to that struggling young democracy. Their costly battle with Russia was for a principle that is really basic to America's national security as well. In a country with 1/8 of our population, more Ukrainian troops have died defending Ukraine from Russia than American troops have perished in Afghanistan. During the months President Trump illegally withheld military aid, as many as 24 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in battle. By withholding security aid from Ukraine for President Trump's personal political benefit, he endangered the security of a fragile democracy. Can there be any deeper betrayal of a president's responsibility than to endanger our national security and the security of an ally for his own personal political gain? And to those of my colleagues who describe the president's conduct as merely inappropriate, I disagree. Disparaging John McCain's service to our country is disgusting and inappropriate. What this president has done to Ukraine crosses that line. It is impeachable. I'll close by remembering two public servants who, like us, were called by history to judge a president. Tom Railsback passed away as this impeachment proceeding began. He was 2 days shy of his 88th birthday. I knew Tom. I considered him a friend. In 1974, Tom was a Republican congressman from Moline, Illinois, and a member of the House Judiciary Committee. He regarded President Nixon as a political friend. He believed that Richard Nixon had achieved much for America, including the opening of the door to China. After studying the Watergate evidence closely, Congressman Railsback came to believe that Richard Nixon had violated the Constitution. When President Nixon refused to turn over records and recordings requested by Congress, Tom Railsback took to the House floor to say, if the Congress doesn't get the material we think we need and then votes to exonerate, we'll be regarded as a paper tiger. When he voted to impeach President Nixon, Tom believed it was probably the end of his career, but he was elected 4 more times. To his dying day, Tom Railsback was proud of his vote. He voted for his country above his party. Bill Cohen, also a Republican, was a freshman congressman at the time and a member of the House Judiciary Committee. He studied the evidence with Tom Railsback and worked with him to draft articles of impeachment. Bill Cohen received death threats, and he thought his votes to impeach President Nixon would be the end of his political career. But he went on to a distinguished career in the House, 3 terms in the Senate, and served as Secretary of Defense. Listen to what Bill Cohen said recently of President Trump's actions, and I quote, "This is presidential conduct that you want to be ashamed of. He is corrupting institutions, politicizing the military, and acts like he is the law." And then Cohen added, "If the president's conduct is acceptable, we really don't have a republic as we've known it anymore." May I respectfully say to my Senate colleagues, Ben Franklin warned us of this day. I will vote guilty on both articles of impeachment against President Donald John Trump, on Article 1, abuse of power, and Article 2, obstruction of Congress. But at this moment of high constitutional drama, I hope my last words can be a personal appeal to my Senate colleagues. Last night, many of us attended a State of the Union address, which was as emotionally charged as any I have ever attended. As divided as our nation may be, and as divided as this Senate may be, we should remember America has weathered greater storms than this impeachment and our current political standoff. It was Abraham Lincoln, in the darkness of our worst storm, who called on us to, quote, "strive on to finish the work we are in, to work to bind the nation's wounds." After this vote, and after this day, those of us who are entrusted with this high office must each do our part to work to bind the wounds of our divided nation. I hope we can leave this chamber with that common resolve. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Carolina.
I'd like unanimous consent to introduce my full statement after my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. So let me just begin with a note of optimism. You're going to get to pick the next president, not a bunch of politicians driven by sour grapes. And I don't say that lightly. I didn't vote for President Trump. I voted for somebody I wouldn't know if they walked in the door. But I accepted the fact that he won. That's been hard for a lot of people. I supported the Mueller investigation. I had Democratic colleagues come to me and say, we're afraid he's going to fire Mueller. Will you stand with us to make sure Mueller can complete his investigation? And I did. 2 years, $32 million, FBI agents, subpoenas, you name it. The verdict is in. What did we find? Nothing. I thought that would be it. But it's never enough when it comes to Trump. Sorry. It's never enough when it comes to President Trump. This sham process is the low point in the Senate for me. If you think you've done the country a good service by legitimizing this impeachment process, what you have done is unleash the partisan forces of hell. This is sour grapes. They impeached the President of the United States in 78 days. You could not get a parking ticket if you contested it in 78 days. They gave out souvenir pins when it was over. If you can't see through that, your hatred of Donald Trump has blinded you to the obvious. This is not about protecting the country. This is about destroying the president. There are no rules when it comes to Donald Trump. Everybody in America can confront the witnesses against them except Donald Trump. Everybody in America can call witnesses on their behalf except President Trump. Everybody in America can introduce evidence except for President Trump. He's not above the law, but you put him below the law. In the process of impeaching this president, you've made it almost impossible for future presidents to do their job. In 78 days, you took due process, as we've come to know it in America, and threw it in the garbage can. This is the first impeachment in the history of the country driven by politicians. The Nixon impeachment had outside counsel, Watergate prosecutors. The Clinton impeachment had Ken Starr, who looked at President Clinton for years before he brought it to Congress. The Mueller investigation went on for 2 years. I trusted Bob Mueller. And when he rendered his verdict, it broke your heart. And you can't let it go. The only way this is going to end permanently is for the president to get reelected. And he will. So as to abuse of Congress, it is a wholesale assault on the presidency. It is abandoning every sense of fairness that every American has come to expect in their own lives. It's driven by blind partisanship and hatred of the man himself. And they wanted to do it in 78 days. Why? Because they wanted to impeach him before the election. I am not making this up. They said that. The reason the president never was allowed to go to court and challenge the subpoenas that were never issued is because the House managers understood it might take time. President Clinton and President Nixon were allowed to go to Article III court and contest the House's action. That was denied this president because it would get in the way of impeaching him before the election. And you send this crap over here, and you're okay with it, my Democratic colleagues. You're okay with the idea that the president was denied his day in court, and you were going to rule on executive privilege as a political body. You're willing to deal out the Article III courts because you hate Trump that much. What you've done is you've weakened the institution of the presidency. And be careful what you wish for, because it's going to come back your way. So abuse of Congress should be entitled abuse of power by the Congress. If you think Adam Schiff is trying to get to the truth, I got a bridge I want to sell you. These people hate Trump's guts. They rammed it through the House in a way you couldn't get a parking ticket, and they achieved their goal of impeaching him before the election. Well, the Senate's going to achieve its goal of acquitting him in February. And the American people are going to get to decide in November who they want to be their president. So acquittal will happen in about 2 hours. Exoneration comes when President Trump gets reelected, because the people of the United States are fed up with this crap. But the damage you have done will be long-lasting. Abuse of power. You're impeaching the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid for a short period of time that they eventually received ahead of schedule to leverage an investigation that never happened. You're going to remove the President of the United States for suspending foreign aid to leverage an investigation of a political opponent that never occurred. The Ukrainians did not know the suspension until September. They didn't feel any pressure. And if you're okay with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden doing what they did, it says more about you than it does anything else. The point of the abuse of power article is that you've made it almost impossible now for any president to pick up the phone if all of us can assume the worst and impeach somebody based on a subjective standard. He was talking about corruption in the Ukraine with a past president. And the Biden's conduct in the Ukraine undercut our ability to effectively deal with corruption by allowing his son to receive $3 million from the most corrupt gas company in the Ukraine. Can you imagine how the Ukrainian parliament must have felt to be lectured by Joe Biden about ending sweetheart deals? What you have done is impeach the President of the United States and willing to remove him because he suspended foreign aid for 40 days to leverage an investigation that never occurred. And to my good friend Dick Durbin, Donald Trump has done more to help the Ukrainian people than Barack Obama did in his entire 8 years. If you're looking for somebody to help the Ukrainian people fight the Russians, how about giving them some weapons? This is a sham. This is a farce. This is disgusting. This is an injustice to President Trump as a person. It's a threat to the office. It will end soon. It's going to be an overwhelming rejection of both articles. We're going to pick up the pieces and try to go forward. But I can say this without any hesitation. I worry about the future of the presidency after what's happened here. Ladies and gentlemen, you will come to regret this whole process. And to those who have these pens, I hope you will understand history will judge those pens as a souvenir of shame. I yield.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
The articles of impeachment before us charged President Donald John Trump with offenses against the Constitution and the American people. The first article of impeachment charges that President Trump abused the office of the presidency by soliciting the interference of a foreign power, Ukraine, to benefit himself in the 2020 election. The president asked a foreign leader to do us a favor, us meaning him, and investigate his political opponents. In order to elicit these political investigations, President Trump withheld a White House meeting and hundreds of millions of dollars in military assistance from an ally at war with Russia. There's extensive documentation in the record proving this quid pro quo and the corrupt motive behind it. The facts are not seriously in dispute. In fact, several Republican senators admitted they believe the president committed this offense with varying degrees of opprobrium: inappropriate, wrong, shameful. Almost all Republicans will argue, however, that this reprehensible conduct does not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. The founders could not have been clearer. William Davey, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, deemed impeachment, quote, an essential security, lest the president, quote, spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself reelected. James Madison offered a specific list of impeachable offenses during the debate in Independence Hall. A president might lose his capacity or embezzle public funds. A despicable soul might succumb to bribes while in office. Madison then arrived at what he believed was the worst conduct a president could engage in: The president could betray his trust to foreign powers, which would be fatal to the republic. Madison's words. When I studied the Constitution and the Federalist Papers in high school, admittedly, I was skeptical of George Washington's warning that, quote, foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government, unquote. It seemed so far-fetched. Who would dare? But the foresight and wisdom of the founders endures. Madison was right. Washington was right. There is no greater subversion of our democracy than for powers outside of our borders to determine elections within them. If Americans believe that they don't determine their senator, their governor, their president, but rather some foreign potentate does, that's the beginning of the end of democracy. For a foreign country to attempt such a thing on its own is contemptible. For an American president to deliberately solicit such a thing, to blackmail a foreign country into helping him win an election, is unforgivable. Now, does this rise to the level of impeachable offense? Of course it does. Of course it does. The term high crimes derives from English law. Crimes were committed between subjects of the monarchy. High crimes were committed against the crown itself. The framers did not design a monarchy. They designed a democracy, a nation where the people were king. High crimes are those committed against the entire people of the United States. The president sought to cheat the people out of a free and fair election. How could such an offense not be deemed a high crime, a crime against the people? As one constitutional scholar in the House Judiciary hearings testified, if this is not impeachable, nothing is. I agree. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the first article of impeachment. The second article of impeachment is equally straightforward. Once the president realized he got caught, he tried to cover it up. The president asserted blanket immunity. He categorically defied congressional subpoenas, ordered his aides not to testify, and withheld the production of relevant documents. Even President Nixon, author of the most infamous presidential cover-up in history, permitted his aides to testify in Congress in the Watergate investigation. The idea that the Trump administration was properly invoking the various rights and privileges of the presidency is nonsense. At each stage of the House inquiry, the administration conjured up a different bad faith justification for evading accountability. There is no circumstance under which the administration would have complied. When I asked the president's counsel twice to name one document or one witness the president provided to Congress, they could not answer. It cannot be that the president, by dint of legal shamelessness, can escape scrutiny entirely. Once again, the facts are not in dispute, but some have sought to portray the second article of impeachment as somehow less important than the first. It is not. The second article of impeachment is necessary if Congress is to ever hold a president accountable again, Democrat or Republican. The consequences of sanctioning such categorical obstruction of Congress would be far-reaching, and they will be irreparable. I judge that President Trump is guilty of the second article of impeachment. The Senate should convict President Trump, remove him from the presidency, and disqualify him from holding future office. The guilt of the president on these charges is so obvious that here again, several Republican senators admit that the House has proved its case. So instead of maintaining the president's innocence, the president's counsel ultimately told the Senate that even if the president did what he was accused of, it's not impeachable. This has taken the form of an escalating series of Dershowitzian arguments, including, quote, abuse of power is not an impeachable offense. Quote, the president can't be impeached for non-criminal conduct, but he also can't be indicted for criminal conduct. Quote, If a president believes his own reelection is essential to the nation, then a quid pro quo is not corrupt. These are the excuses of a child caught in a lie, each explanation more outlandish and desperate than the last. It would be laughable if not for the fact that the cumulative effect of these arguments would render not just this president, but all presidents immune from impeachment and therefore above the law. Now, several members of this chamber said that even if the president is guilty, and even if it's impeachable, the Senate still shouldn't convict the president because there's an election coming up. As if the framers forgot about elections when they wrote the impeachment clause. If the founders believed that even when a president is guilty of an impeachable offense that the next election should decide his fate, they never would have included an impeachment clause in the Constitution. That much is obvious. Alone, each of the defenses advanced by the President's counsel comes close to being preposterous. Together, they are as dangerous to the Republic as this president, a fig leaf so large as to excuse any presidential misconduct. Unable to defend the president, arguments were found to make him a king. Let future generations know that only a fraction of the Senate swallowed these fantasies. The rest of us condemn them to the ash heap of history and the derision of first-year law students everywhere. We are only the third Senate in history to sit as a court of impeachment for the president. The task we were given was not easy, but the framers gave the Senate this responsibility because they could not imagine any other body capable of it. They considered others, but they entrusted us to us, and the Senate failed. The Republican caucus trained its outrage not on the conduct of the president, but on the impeachment process in the House, deriding falsely an alleged lack of fairness and thoroughness. The conjured outrage was so blinding that the Republican majority ended up guilty of the very sins it falsely accused the House of committing. It conducted the least fair, least thorough, most rushed impeachment trial in the history of this country. A simple majority of senators denied the Senate's right to examine relevant evidence, to call witnesses, to review documents, and to properly try the impeachment of the president, making this the first impeachment trial in history that heard from no witnesses. A simple majority of senators, in deference to, and most likely in fear of, the president of their party, perpetrated a great miscarriage of justice in the trial of President Trump. As a result, the verdict of this kangaroo court will be meaningless. By refusing the facts, by refusing witnesses and documents, the Republican majority has placed a giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, next to the acquittal of President Trump, written in permanent ink. Acquittal in an unfair trial with this giant asterisk, the asterisk of a sham trial, is worth nothing at all to President Trump or to anybody else. No doubt, the president will boast he received total exoneration, but we know better. We know this wasn't a trial by any stretch of the definition, and the American people know it too. We've heard a lot about the framers over the past several weeks, about the impeachment clause they forged, the separation of powers they wrought, the conduct they most feared in our chief magistrate. But there is something the founders considered even more fundamental to our republic: truth. The founders had seen and studied societies governed by the iron fist of tyrants and the divine right of kings, but none by argument, rational thinking, facts, debate. Hamilton said the American people would determine, quote, whether societies are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or forever destined to depend on accident and force. And what an astonishing thing the founders did. They placed a bet with long odds. They believed that reflection and choice would make us capable of self-government, that we wouldn't agree on everything, but at least we could agree on a common baseline of fact and of truth. They wrote a constitution with the remarkable idea that even the most powerful person in our country was not above the law and could be put on trial, a place where you seek truth. The faith our founders placed in us makes the failure of this Senate even more damning. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but there was no truth here. The Republican majority couldn't let truth into this trial. The Republican majority refused to get the evidence because they were afraid of what it might show. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth, but in order to countenance this president, you have to ignore the truth. Republicans walk through the halls with their heads down. They didn't see the tweet. They can't respond to everything he says. They hope he learned his lesson this time. Yes, maybe this time he learned his lesson. Our nation was founded on truth. But in order to excuse this president, you have to willfully ignore the truth and indulge in the president's conspiracy theories. Millions of people voted illegally. The deep state is out to get them. Ukraine interfered in our elections. You must attempt to normalize his behavior. Obama did it too, they falsely claim. Democrats are just as bad. Our nation was founded on the idea of truth. But this president is such a menace, so contemptuous of every virtue, so dishonorable, so dishonest, that you must ignore, indeed sacrifice, the truth to maintain his favor. The trial of this president, its failure, reflects the central challenge of this presidency and maybe the central challenge of this time in our democracy. You cannot be on the side of this president and be on the side of truth. And if we are to survive as a nation, we must choose truth. Because if the truth doesn't matter, if the news you don't like is fake, if cheating in an election is acceptable, if everyone is as wicked as the wickedest among us, then the hope for the future is lost. The eyes of the nation are upon this Senate, and what they see will strike doubt in the heart of even the most ardent patriot. The House managers established the president abused the great power of his office to try to cheat in an election, and the Senate majority is poised to look the other way. So I direct my final message, not to the House managers, not even to my fellow senators, but to the American people. My message is simple. Don't lose hope. There is justice in this world, and truth, and right. I believe that. I wouldn't be in this government if I didn't. Somehow, in ways we can't predict, with God's mysterious hand guiding us, truth and right will prevail. There have been dark periods in our history, but we always overcome. The Senate's opening prayer yesterday was Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The long arc of the moral universe, my fellow Americans, does bend towards justice. America does change for the better, but not on its own. It took millions of Americans hundreds of years to make this country what it is today. Americans of every age and color and creed who marched and protested, who stood up and sat in. Americans who defended this democracy, this beautiful democracy, in its darkest hours. On Memorial Day in 1884, Oliver Wendell Holmes told his war-weary audience that, quote, whether one accepts from fortune her spade and will look downward and dig, or from aspiration her axe and cord and will scale the ice, the one and only success which is yours to command is to bring to your work a mighty heart. I have confidence that Americans of a different generation, our generation, will bring to our work a mighty heart to fight for what's right, to fight for the truth, and never, never lose faith. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
the United States Senate was made for moments like this. The framers predicted that factional fever might dominate House majorities from time to time. They knew the country would need a firewall to keep partisan flames from scorching our republic. So they created the Senate. Out of necessity, James Madison wrote, of some stable institution in the government. Of some stable institution in the government. Today, we will fulfill this founding purpose. We will reject this incoherent case that comes nowhere near justifying the first presidential removal in history. This partisan impeachment will end today. But I fear the threat to our institutions may not, because this episode is one of a symptom of something much deeper. In the last 3 years, the opposition to this president has come to revolve around a truly dangerous concept. Leaders in the opposite party increasingly argue that if our institutions don't produce the outcomes they like, our institutions themselves must be broken. One side has decided that defeat simply means the whole system is broken, that we literally tear up the rules and write new ones. Normally, when a party loses an election, it accepts defeat. It reflects and retools. But not this time. Within months, Secretary Clinton was suggesting her defeat was invalid. She called our president illegitimate. Former president falsely claimed that President Trump didn't actually win. He lost the election, the former president said. And members of Congress have used similar rhetoric. A disinformation campaign, weakening confidence in our democracy. The very real issue of foreign election interference was abused to fuel conspiracy theories. For years, prominent voices said there'd been a secret conspiracy between the president's campaign and a foreign government. But when the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intelligence Committee debunked that, the delegitimizing endeavor didn't stop. Remember what Chairman Schiff said here on the floor. He suggested that if the American people re-elect President Trump in November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. That's Chairman Schiff on this floor, saying if the American people re-elect President Trump this November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. So they still don't accept the American voters' last decision. And now they're preparing to reject the voters' next decision if they don't like the outcome. Not only the last decision, but the next decision. Heads, we win. Tails, you cheated. And who can trust our democracy anyway, they say. This kind of talk creates more fear and division than our foreign adversaries could achieve in their wildest dreams. As Dr. Hill testified, our adversaries seek to divide us against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy. And as she noted, if Americans become consumed by partisan rancor, we can easily do that work for them. The architects of this impeachment claimed they were defending norms and traditions. In reality, it was an assault on both. First, the House attacked its own precedents on fairness and due process, and by rushing to use the impeachment power as a political weapon of first resort. Then their articles attacked the office of the presidency. Then they attacked the Senate and called us treacherous. Then the far left tried to impugn the Chief Justice for remaining neutral during the trial. And now, for the final act, the Speaker of the House is trying to steal the Senate's sole power to render a verdict. The Speaker says she will just refuse to accept this acquittal. Speaker of the House says she refuses to accept this acquittal. Whatever that means. Perhaps she will tear up the verdict like she tore up the State of the Union address. So I would ask my distinguished colleagues across the aisle, is this really where you want to go? The president isn't the president. An acquittal isn't an acquittal. Attack institutions until they get their way. Even my colleagues who may not agree with this president must see the insanity of this logic. It's like saying you're so worried about a bull in a china shop that you want to bulldoze the china shop to chase it out. And here's the most troubling part. The most troubling part. There is no sign this attack on our institutions will end here. In recent months, Democratic presidential candidates and Senate leaders have toyed with killing a filibuster so the Senate could approve radical changes with less deliberation and less persuasion. Several of our colleagues sent an extraordinary brief to the Supreme Court threatening political retribution if the justices did not decide a case the way they wanted. We've seen proposals to turn the FEC, the regulator of elections and political speech, into a partisan body for the first time ever. All these things, Mr. President, all these things, a toxic temptation to stop debating policy within our great American governing traditions and instead declare a war on the traditions themselves. A war on the traditions themselves. So, colleagues, whatever policy differences we may have, we should all agree this is precisely the kind of recklessness the Senate was created to stop. The response to losing one election cannot be to attack the office of the presidency. The response to losing several elections cannot be to threaten the Electoral College. The response to losing a court case cannot be to threaten the judiciary. The response to losing a vote cannot be to threaten the Senate. We simply cannot let factional fever break our institutions. It must work the other way, as Madison and Hamilton intended. The institutions must break the fever, rather than the other way around. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. That, Mr. President, is what we will do when we end this precedent-breaking impeachment. I hope we will look back on this vote and say, this was the day the fever began to break. I hope we will not say, this was just the beginning. I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.